As we continue on, getting closer to Wednesday, where we will take a grand overview on Judges 17 through 21, or the end of the book, I want to continue to look at these chapters. And today we're going to be looking at chapter 18. I think the big thing within this chapter is uh, covetousness or coveting, and the danger of that, not just in the action itself, which is I'm wanting something that I don't have, that I feel like I should or that I deserve. It's not just that, but instead it can grow into something much more than that, and in ways a lot more dangerous than that, as we will see in Judges chapter 18. So, with that being said, turn to Judges chapter 18. We're going to look at the whole entire chapter here today, starting, of course, in verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. This is, of course, going right back to Judges chapter 17, where we see this phrase come up, and then we will see it again in the very last verse of the book in 21:25. Here, though, it just makes it clear that everything that is going on, not just in 17, but 18 through 21, is happening because of this fact. Now, there's two ways to look at this, just like what we talked about in 17. Option one, that there is no physical human king in Israel. Yes, that is true. Now, he is eventually coming in the person of King Saul, which is, by the way, not a good thing. And then, of course, with King David as well. But so you don't have a physical human leader to step in and say, hey, Danites, you really need to think about what you are about to do. The Danites being those of the tribe of Dan. Um, that could have happened if there was a godly human king in Israel. That could have happened, but it doesn't. And so that's option one. Option two is that they no longer, the people of Israel, they no longer at this point believe that the Lord is their king and their only king that they need. That has gone away. They no longer believe in that. And it is just such a sad point. That is where they have come to when it comes to Judges chapter 18. And, well, we see the results of that unbelief and that loss uh, of relationship with the Lord that their ancestors had. And, uh, and we see that here specifically in chapter 18. Continuing in verse 1. And in those days, the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. Now, there's a couple things that we need to discuss here with this. First off, with the tribe of Dan, they're not the oldest. Dan was not the oldest son of, Jacob. Um, he was also not the youngest son of Jacob. So he's somewhere in between those two. And in ancient Near Eastern culture, it would be a lot better to be the oldest, and it would be kind of a bummer to be the youngest. But in the middle, you're kind of just in this moot point, like in the stalemate. There's no great rewards, but there's also no there's no looking down on you either, because you're the youngest. So it's this kind of weird space that Dan is in, and yes, his descendants are not Dan specifically, but they are from him. So that feeling of being in the middle or the middle child, is very much still on the descendants of Dan. And I think that continues here, which then builds into the covetousness that they have that we see in chapter 18. Second, when it says, "For until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them," there's a reason why this is said. It can be very confusing on the surface and may seem even contradictory, but not exactly. So, let's break this down. First off, you have them actually getting an inheritance when they enter the promised land. So go, and you can pause, take your time, but go back to Joshua chapter 19. Joshua chapter 19, we're going to be looking at verses 40 through 48. Now, this chapter in Joshua 19 is a very historical chapter when it comes to how this chapter is written. The writing style of this chapter is very historical in nature. So with that being said, a lot of that's why you see a lot of names and a lot of locations because they are allotting the land to the different tribes. So that's one. What's interesting, though, is that within this chapter, Dan is left last. They are left last. And not just in writing, but it literally is the seventh lot came out for the tribe of the people of Dan according to their clans, according to Joshua 19:40. Again, just feeling this, yes, we're in the middle, but we kind of feel left out and we kind of feel almost like the youngest in a way because we were left for last, at least when it comes to Joshua 19. And so that just building this tension within the tribe of Dan. But let's continue to read though in Joshua 19, picking up in verse 41. And the territory of its inheritance included Zorah, Eshtaol, Ir Shemesh, Sha'al-Labin, Aijalon, Ithla, Elon, Timnah, Ekron, Eltekeh, Gibbethon, Bealath, Jehud, Beni Barak, Gath Rimmon, and Majarkon and Raycon, with the territory over against Joppa. So, a lot of different names there. A lot of different names there. Couple things here. First off, the Joppa that's mentioned at the end of verse 46, could that be the same Joppa that is connected with Jonah later on in the Old Testament? Very, very possible. Is it the same one? It's hard to tell. But is it possible that it's the same one? It is very possible because what's interesting about all of these cities is it gives you a picture of where this is at. It's most likely coastland and probably the western part of Israel and also a little bit of the northern part as well when it comes to the ancient country of Israel at this time. That's what, if you look at an ancient atlas or map, that is really what you are going to be seeing with all these different cities. Again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where every single one of these are, but based on uh, other historical documents during this time and archaeology, we can kind of pinpoint uh, for sure some of these. And so that is really interesting. Uh, Now, the other thing that is very, very interesting is that in Judges chapter 18, in verse 2, it only talks about Zorah and Eshtaol. And it really only talks about those two. And we'll get back to verse 2 in a second. Um, but here you have these list of names. So, why is it that it's only talking about Zor and Eshtaol in chapter 18 of Judges, but in Joshua chapter 19, it's giving you this long list of names? Well, something happened. And we see that not just in Joshua 19, but also in Judges chapter 1. So let's start with Joshua 19, because we're still there. Picking up in verse 47. When the territory of the people of Dan was lost to them, the people of Dan went up and fought against Leshem, and after capturing it and striking it with the sword, they took possession of it and settled in it, calling Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the people of Dan, according to their clans, these cities with their villages. So, something happens, and they are conquered. They lose part of their land. And I believe that they lose basically everything except for Zorah and Eshtaol, because that is what is mentioned in Judges chapter 18. But what's interesting is that when it's talking about this conquering of Leshem and calling it Dan, this is actually what we are going to read about in Judges chapter 18 with Laish. And they call, once they settle it in a way that's not great, but we'll get to that soon. Um, the After they settle it, they call the place Dan. And so, do I think that Leshem and Laish are either one and the same, or maybe Leshem is the territory and Laish is the city? I do. And not only because it's mentioned here, but because it's mentioned in Judges chapter 1. So go back to the book of Judges and then go all the way back to chapter 1. And we are going to be looking at verses 34 through 36 of Judges chapter 1. Now, before we do, Judges 127 through 36 is very, very important to understand why it's there. When Israel goes into the promised land, they are told to basically take over the land, to conquer it. Now, that is for a different day. That is a different topic, and we won't spend that time here. The conquest of Canaan, whether it be in the book of Joshua or being referenced to in Judges chapter 1, is very much a discussion that has been had, I'm sure is being had, or have, and then will be had, will be have, is very much a discussion. And so here we will not talk about that today. But they were asked to do this by the Lord, and some do, but definitely some don't. And in verses 27 through 36 of Judges chapter 1, it shows you the failures of some of these tribes of Israel to not conquer those places completely. And what's interesting is those that are left that are not conquered come back to bite Israel in the butt for not doing so, and not just in a physical, like a conquering way, but in a spiritual way. I think slowly, drip by drip, they start to influence Israel, who are supposed to be set apart for the Lord, and drip by drip, they stray. And I think that is one of the big reasons why we see this mess that we're in the book of Judges. And we start right off the bat with Judges 1. Judges 1, 34 through 36 is talking about Dan, though, specifically. So let's read that. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Malharis, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. So, yeah, you have the Amorites attacking Dan and getting them back into, pushing them back into the hill country. And I think this mention of the attack of Dan is what is being referenced to in Joshua chapter 19. Now, with this being said, the chronology or the timing of it. Is this a contradictory, or is this common in historical writing at that time? Yes, it's very much a thing because you would have. Um, you would have scribes during that time, and it is very, very possible uh, that Joshua 19 verses 40 through 48, specifically 47 and 48, could have been written later on after the death of Joshua, and of course, after the attack on the tribe of Dan that we see in Judges chapter 1. So, for me, I believe that's probably what's going on here. That Joshua chapter 19 is a either a looking forward to what will happen, because again, the Lord is the true author of Scripture, and so of course He knows what's going to happen. So you have that, or you do have these scribes that would write these, again, very historical style sections of Scripture. So me personally, I think it's probably um, it's probably the first. I do think that scribes are important. However, I think the Lord knew exactly what was going to happen, and He told the author of Joshua, could have been Joshua, possibly, but He told the author of the book of Joshua to write this down. And again, it's not a trance, but again, that's for a different day. But I think that is really probably the answer to that, based on the accuracy of that account for what we see in Judges chapter 18. So, with all, uh, going back to Judges chapter 18, verse 2. So, the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, go and explore the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. So a couple of things. First off, you see again the mention of Zora and Eshtaol. But what's interesting is that the 5 men are from the whole number of their tribe, and only those 2 cities are mentioned. So that just goes back to that whole discussion of Judges 1 and Joshua 19. Uh, but yeah, very, very interesting. And so they're given this command to go and explore the land. This is where I think the coveting starts to take place. And don't get me wrong, it's hard to lose things. It's so hard to lose things, and you feel this sense uh, of wrongdoing when you lose those things, and that's totally understood. But to go from that to coveting something that is not yours, and just because you are coveting the other things that people have, or in this case, the more amount of space and land that the other tribes of Israel had, that leads them down a darker path. And for you and I, that can be very much the same. And so it is very, very important, even when we have lost things, whether it be um, whether it be a car or a job or finances. It's hard to lose those things. But do not, do not then run to coveting instead. Because not only will that lead to coveting, of course, but that could lead to envy, that could lead to jealousy, um, that could lead to dishonesty, that could lead to so many disobedience, disobedience to the Lord, so many different things. Um, and I think we're going to absolutely see that here. And then finally, Mike is thrown in there from Judges 17, and knowing how that went, it's not a good sign. Well, and it's not. Verse 3. When they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and they turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" Very, very good questions. And I think knowing that it says the voice of the young Levite, it almost makes you go, okay, they can tell that he's not from Ephraim. They know that. Now they just need more information, but that they definitely know, and that piques their interest. Verse 4. And he said to them, he being the Levite, "This is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest." And they said to him, "Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord." Few things. First, there is no mention that he is a priest of the Lord in verse 4. He just says, "And I have become his," meaning Micah's priest. There is no mention of who's God or goddess or the Lord that he is under as a priest. That should, for the Danites, make them go, something's a little fishy here. Something's a little bit off. That should be the case, but it's not. And I think that is really, really important to see. So that's first thing that I see. Second, um, when they say inquire of God, they are. It could be that they know that he is a Levite at this point. Is very, very possible. Because again, he doesn't say who he's a priest of, and yet they say inquire of God instead of a god or Baal or some other god. They say God in Hebrew. And so for me, that makes me wonder if they know that he is a Levite. And so they ask him, though, "Hey, will our journey to find new land succeed or not?" And the priest does not hesitate. He actually probably didn't even leave the room, and he most certainly did not pray, because verse 6 is, I think, immediate. And the priest said to them, I don't think there's any hesitation. He gives them the answer right away. And the answer is good, probably because that's what the Danites wanted to hear. But again, they should have gone, well, wait a second. You didn't even look like you were praying. You didn't pray. You didn't go into a separate room to pray. You didn't take time while praying. It was immediate. It was right then and there. And that should have made them go, again, something's fishy here. But what's interesting is, even though the Levi priest, uses the name of the Lord here, there is no indication that the Lord has actually blessed what is going to happen in chapter 18. And really, this is the case for 17 through 21. There is no mention that the Lord has decided that this is what it's going to be. Now, granted, he knows what's going to happen, and everything does happen, but when when the Levite priest here says that you are under the eye of the Lord, or the Lord is watching over you, and so therefore go because the Lord is blessing you, that's just not the case, because the Lord never actually says this or agrees to this. Uh, the Levite priest basically just uses the name of the Lord to further his narrative, to further his quote unquote goal or mission, which from chapter 17, remember, was just to find a place. But we'll get to that more in a second. So, verse 7. Then the five men departed and came to Laish. Again, I believe that is connected to Leshem that we saw in Joshua chapter 19, verse 47. I do think there is probably some sort of connection between Laish and Leshem. And saw the people who were there, how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. Most likely, these folks are probably Sidonians that are just a faction of Sidonians that didn't want to live where Sidonians lived at that time, probably Sidon. And so they wanted to have their own space, which is why they came to Laish. Uh, and they feel very much at home there. That is their home. But I think the reason why it's mentioned that they are far from the Sidonians is that they will have no help whatsoever at the end of this chapter for what is going to happen. But yeah, I think that's why that is mentioned there. Verse 8. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, What do you report? They said, Arise, and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. Now, this is a really interesting report because it reminds me of the report of the Israelite spies, including Joshua and Caleb, to Moses in Numbers chapter 13. He sent out spies into the land of Canaan to see what they would find, who they would find, and for the most part, the land itself was great, but there were very intimidating people that lived there, and they weren't so quite sure if they could take it, except for two spies, and that was Joshua and Caleb. And, well, sadly, the other spies went out, and the people of Israel don't want to go into the land, and so therefore they're sent on a 40-year wilderness odyssey. And then they finally come back and go into the promised land, finally, this time under Joshua. But it very much has that same feeling to it. But here, the spies, they don't hesitate, and they're going in. And they all give a good report. And, well, of course, then Dan is excited. They muster the troops. Verse 11. So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol. Now, when it says armed with weapons of war, does that mean that the 600 are soldiers per se? I would say so. Most likely they are. Could it be that they are just armed? Yes, but when it says armed with weapons of war, I would say, especially with that distinct weapons of war, I would think that they would have some sort of experience with these weapons. Um, that's my that's what I'm seeing there, at least. Verse 12. And went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Mahanadan to this day. Mahanadan basically means the camp of Dan. Straightforward. Behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. So Micah comes in again. Um, First off, with the five that went there, Mike wasn't there. They just talked to the priest, and now you have the five going again, but they are also being followed by 600 men as well, and most likely 600 warriors or soldiers. Verse 14. Then the five men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, "Do you know that in these houses there are an ephod?" Which again is a breastplate that a priest would wear, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image. Now, therefore, consider what you will do. So it isn't exactly told before how they know about these items, but they do find out. And so whether it is during that first time they were at Micah's house, or maybe this time they know about these things that he has. And I think the sentence, "Now therefore consider what you will do," is very interesting. For me, I think it gives them two options here. First, you could do the godly thing and hold Micah accountable and say, "What is this? Like, we're supposed to follow after the Lord. Like, why do you have these things here?" And that should be the case. And they did say, by the way, earlier on, "Inquire of the Lord for us." So it almost makes you go, is Dan really godly? Oh, that's cool. Well, that's option one. Option two, they take everything. And that's what happens, sadly. Verse 15. And they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the five men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the cave with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And when these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Keep quiet. Put your hand on your mouth, and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be priest to the house of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel?" So they take everything. The servant catches them in the act, and he asks a very genuine question: "What are you doing?" Their response is basically a threat: "Keep quiet, put your hand on your mouth, and come with us." But then they had this phrase that's going back to 17 again, chapter 17, "and be to us a father and a priest." Again, they have no clue who this guy is. And yet they want him not only to be a priest, but a father figure to them, somebody they can look up to and go to for advice and for counsel. And they have no clue who he is, besides the fact that he may or may not have prayed for them beforehand. It just it's really it's just messed up. And of course, they offer him something. They offer him to, well, you could be the priest of one man, which is, okay, and has a little bit of fame and reputation and a reward and housing, because again, he was just looking for a place, according to Judges 17. But now you could be all of that and more, because you would be over a whole tribe and clan in Israel. Well, of course, the priest accepts. Verse 20. And the priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people of Dan. First, how this starts is just so sad. And the priest's heart was glad, because he's getting fame and reputation and a better house, probably, like a better living situation. It's just, it's very, very sad to see and read. But now Micah does make an appearance. Verse 21. So they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. Now I do have to pause here. Oh, this should not be the case. You would never, ever put the little ones in the front lines. Now, yes, it's not a military strategy or a military formation, but even when you're traveling through lands that you do not know, with people that you do not know, even if they're, of course, they're all Israelites, but they're people you do not know, you would never put the children in front. Maybe you would put them in the back, but most likely you would put them in the middle where you would have protection in front of the children and in the back of the children, because again, the children are the legacy for the people at that time. They mean so much in this culture. Livestock and the goods, is it important? Yes. So again, it could be in the middle, but it's probably more towards the back uh, because it's livestock and goods. But that to me just goes, oh my gosh, this is really just awful. Verse 22. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's home were called out, or basically his neighbors, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah. So at this point, Micah has not been in his house for all of this, but now is in this crowd with his neighbors. What is the matter with you that you come with such a company? This is Dan asking Micah. Yes, this is Dan asking Micah this. And he, being Micah, said in verse 24, You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away, and what have I left? How then do you ask me, What is the matter with you? Ah, it's just, it's so sad to read. Somebody that should know who the Lord is and has this great, just history of what the Lord has done being passed down through generations should know who he is. And yet, he is so distraught about losing his idols that he says, What have I left? Well, why does he say that? Because he never actually believed in the Lord in the first place. And it's just, it's so sad to see this. But again, I'm not trying to blame Micah just completely, because when you and I are so attached to people or things that are not the Lord, are not Jesus, then we kind of feel the same way. When those things are taken away or reduced in our life, we feel this sense of dissatisfaction or emptiness that, well, the reason why we feel that is because we put those things in the place of Jesus, in the place of Him that saved us. And He alone should have our heart and our desires and our will and our action and our words and our thoughts. And and again, I'm not saying that you have to be perfect in everything that you do, because we live in a sinful world still, but for me, I can understand why he feels the sense of emptiness and loss, because he doesn't have a relationship with the Lord. Yes, I do have a relationship with the Lord, but when I am not obeying him and I'm putting things or people in a place of him, I feel this sense of dissatisfaction and emptiness, because those things or those people are temporary, whereas the Lord is eternal. I think that is what is really going on there. And so, in a way, you can understand why he makes this proclamation, even as dumb as it sounds to you and I as followers of Jesus. I think that's what's going on. Just to clear that up. So, verse 25. And the people of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." They threatened him. Then the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, even with his neighbors around him as well, he turned and went back to his home. Another reason why I think these 600 are probably trained soldiers. So Micah has lost everything. According to him, he's lost everything, because of how much value put on his idols. Which again is a sad thing to say for somebody that is living in Israel and from Israel. Um, verse 27. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire. Ooh, very, very dark stuff. And, and again, one big thing that you see here is that the Lord is not mentioned at all. This is what happens to you and I as human beings if the Lord would leave us to our own devices. This is exactly what would happen. We would turn on neighbors. We would turn on acquaintances. We would turn on strangers. All of that would happen in a blink of an eye. And those that know the Lord, or know about the Lord, know about the Lord and have the history that Israel does, uh, even they can do some just horrific things. And Judges 17 through 21 is absolutely an example of that. Is it hard to read? Yes. Is it hard to hear? Yes. But does that mean that we skip it? Not at all. It's good to read through these things, not because they're easy to read, especially what's coming up later, but because it shows you and I the absolute need for a Savior, the absolute need for Jesus Christ. And I think that is exactly what we see here. Verse 28. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. They were all alone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rahab. Then they rebuilt the city of Laish, and lived in it. They being Dan, the tribe of Dan. And they named the city Dan after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first, which is again why I think it's connected to Joshua chapter 9, 19, verse 47. Verse 30. The people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. So the carved image, probably the carved image of Micah, that's my guess. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. Now, this is a couple questions here, for sure. Moses is actually in the line of Levi, and so Jonathan would be the grandson of Moses. So how does a Levite, not the Levite, I don't think Jonathan is the Levite priest that has been talked about in chapter 17 and this chapter. I don't think that is the same person. I do think there would be some mention of the connection between the two. I do think, though, that uh, I do think though that it is a little bit weird how Jonathan, who should be in the line of Levi, comes to live with the line of Dan, and especially works as priest for them as well. Gershom is the son of Moses. Um, some texts have said that the Hebrew word for Moses should actually be Manasseh. I don't see that in most contexts, or sorry, in most ancient texts. It usually is the Hebrew word for Moses and not the Hebrew word for Manasseh, which are pretty close in spelling. The Hebrew letter Nun is the only difference, or one of the big differences. Sorry, one of the big differences between those two Hebrew words. Me personally, I do believe, especially with the mention of Gershom, I do believe that this Hebrew word is Moses. But again, this should make you go, whether it's Moses or Manasseh, it should make you go, oh my goodness, everything is just falling apart and everything is just going haywire. And what's interesting is, too, even if, so whether Jonathan is the Levite priest mentioned earlier or if he's somebody different, it is interesting if Jonathan isn't that Levite priest from earlier, because then that basically means that that Levite priest uh, kind of got the short end of the stick, to be honest. He kind of got ripped off because he was promised to be the priest over the whole entire tribe. Um, Again, is it possible that Jonathan is the Levi priest from earlier? Yes. But is he? I can't say for certain. And, but my guess is he's not. Because again, there's no explicit, direct connection between the Levite man and Jonathan. But verse 31, so they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. Again, just a sad, sad ending. Um, Covetousness, or this desire to have as much land that the other tribes of Israel had, led to bribery, led to murder, led to uh, disobedience. I mean, it just led to so many different things. It wasn't just coveting, it was all these different things. And I think we see that here in Judges chapter 18. So, with that being said, sorry, with that being said, thank you for spending a little bit of time with me in Judges chapter 18. We will continue to look through Judges 17 through 21 with Judges chapter 19 tomorrow. I will see you then. Thanks.